All right, how much stock are we putting into the it's hard to beat a team twice deal? Georgia and Texas are playing this Saturday in the SEC championship game, 4:00. Both of these teams are in the playoff. I don't know if that takes anything away from the game. Obviously, the winner is going to get a 1-4 seed and a first round bye. The loser is going to get a first round home game, somewhere 5-8. It's not an elimination game for either team. It's still a big deal. I still think the SEC championship is a big deal. I would love for Georgia to win the SEC championship. I'm sure Texas feels the same way. I still think it's a bragging point to have. I don't think by any means that it's some kind of a worthless, pointless, or meaningless game. However, unlike some years past, last year, as an example, the loser of the SEC championship game, that was kind of it. Georgia lost to Alabama by 3 or 4, whatever it was, and they were eliminated from the playoffs, and Bama got in. So that's not the case this year, right? But, how much do you value, I guess, a first-round bye versus a potential home playoff game in the first round? I think, actually, what matters more even than that is the seeding in terms of, okay, it's great that you get a first round bye, but then who might you have to play in the second round? Or if you don't get the first round bye, but you get a first round home playoff game, who is that against? And if you beat that team, what are the two possibilities of teams you'd have to play next versus if you had the first round bye? So the seeding and the brackets and the directions that they go and what potential teams you would face in your next game, to me is, I guess, a little bit of a bigger deal, maybe even than the first round bye. On the other hand, you've got a lot of teams. Georgia, I'm sure Texas has got some players too that are banged up, hurt, injured, maybe some that aren't playing, maybe some that could play in 2 weeks, maybe some that couldn't play in 2 weeks but could play in 3 or 4 weeks. So you're thinking, okay, let's get through this game. We get the bye. Then we don't have to play till New Year's Eve, right? So you got, this set of players maybe who can't play now but would be able to play by New Year's Eve. So there's a lot that goes into kind of looking at the game and going, what's the benefit of losing versus the drawback of winning? Or what's the benefit of winning versus the drawback of losing? And then if you lose, are there any potential benefits from that? The only potential benefit from losing would be the draw that you get in the bracket. And that's really unknown because we don't know exactly where the teams are going to be seeded going forward after that. But get back to the original question here. The whole kind of talking point, and I feel like that's what it is more than anything else, is a talking point about, well, it's hard to beat a team twice. I'm not sure if that's true. I think it's hard to beat a good team twice because it's hard to beat a good team once, right? If Texas, for example, played Michigan, or who else did they play this year? Mississippi State, or Oklahoma. Those are generally considered to be not very good teams this year. If Texas played those teams twice, would they lose to any of them the second time? If they played them 10 times, how many times would they lose to them? 1 out of 10? If Georgia played Auburn or Mississippi State or Florida or Kentucky or whatever, fill in the blank, just this group of teams that Georgia has played that are considered, again, generally to be not very good. And yes, I know Georgia only beat Kentucky by 1. That's kind of the point I'm getting at here. How many times would Georgia lose out of 10 to those teams? Not very many, less than half, right? So I don't put all that much stock or faith in just the blanket statement of, well, it's hard to beat a team twice. I can go through any team schedule in the country and pick out, any good team, any playoff caliber team, whether you want to go Indiana, Tennessee, Penn State, take Tennessee for an example. We'll do the opposite thing with Tennessee, okay? So Tennessee loses on the road to Arkansas. If Tennessee played Arkansas again, does Tennessee lose to them again? Probably not. What if they played 10 times? How many times would Tennessee beat Arkansas? 8, 9, right? They lost the first one. So anyway, I don't put too much stock in the first game between Georgia and Texas for a lot of reasons. That's one of them. So, okay, Georgia beat Texas by 15 or whatever it was when we played them the first time. That doesn't mean that Georgia's beating Texas by 15 this time. It also doesn't mean that Texas is winning the game just because Georgia beat them the first time, and it's hard to beat a team twice. It's hard to beat a good team twice, and Texas is a good team. So this is going to be hard for Georgia to beat Texas. It's going to be hard for Texas to beat Georgia. These are two really good teams without getting into an argument about, who you think the quote unquote best 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever teams are in the country. Both Georgia and Texas would be in that list of teams. And so it's hard for anybody to beat Texas. It's hard for anybody to beat Georgia. It's hard for one of them to beat the other. It's hard for them to beat each other. So I understand the talking point, I guess. Well, it's hard to beat a team twice. I think it's hard to beat a good team twice because it's hard to beat a good team once. But specifically about this game here, there's a couple of things that jump out to me right away when I look at this game. Number one is you've got sort of a low-level approach that you can take that goes, well, Georgia beat them by 15 the first time in Austin. Surely they'll beat them on a neutral field. Well, one game doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other. When you look at the way that game unfolded in Austin, there's a lot of things that happened in that game. There's a lot of sort of directions that game went that aren't easily repeatable on both sides, by the way. So to the argument that goes, well, Georgia beat them by 15 in Austin, so they're obviously going to beat them on a neutral field. I would tell you this to push back on that. Georgia had 5 scoring drives in that game. All but one of them started in Texas territory. Do you think that's likely to happen again? Probably not. Now, the reason those drives started in Texas territory were not primarily from turnovers, although there were some turnovers in this game. Texas dug themselves into a hole early in this game, field position wise. Texas started a lot of possessions inside their 15, inside their 10-yard line, and Georgia's defense played really, really good. Both of those things are true, right? It's not just that Texas started drives inside their 10. Hell, Georgia played Georgia Tech last week, and Georgia Tech had multiple 70 and 80-yard drives that went all the way down the field and went to the red zone. So it is possible to have a 70, 80, 90-yard drive against Georgia or any other team and drive down the field. So it's not just that Texas started backed up in their own end. It's also true Georgia defensively played one of, if not their best games of the season that day on the road in Austin, Texas. But what is the likelihood that Texas average starting field position in this game is the 15-yard line or whatever, which is about what it seems like it was in that first game? Texas got backed up. They either went 3 and out, or maybe they got 1 first down and they were kicking from their 20-yard line or whatever. And Georgia was fielding punts at midfield or in plus territory. And that's how you end up with scoring drives of 30 yards, 40 yards, 45 yards. I think Georgia's longest scoring drive was 55 yards, a drive that started on their own 45, almost at midfield. That's not likely to be repeated in this game, not even specifically because of anything Georgia or Texas did in that game or will do in this game or will do differently this time versus last time. Just odds alone of things happening lead you to believe that Georgia's average field position in this game is probably not going to be midfield, which was great last time. And Texas' average starting field position is probably not going to be their own 10-yard line. Average starting field positions in this game are probably going to work back towards the average for both teams. So Georgia is liable to have a much worse starting fielding position per drive in this game than they were last time. And Texas is liable to have a much better starting field position than they were in the last game. So to just look at it and go, well, Georgia shut them down and they won by 2 scores and the game wasn't particularly close and they beat them there. So that's a little bit too basic of an approach to take. There's another approach that people are taking that are sort of based on that idea that goes, well, all that stuff that buried Texas deep in their own end, and this go-round's not going to happen. So therefore, the game's obviously going to be much closer, and Texas will have a pretty good chance to win. Well, to that, I would say, Carson Beck threw 3 interceptions in that game. Is that likely to repeat itself? Now, some of you might say, yeah, I would say no. No one was harder on Carson Beck the first half of the season than I was. He was a turnover machine. It was unacceptable. I was at the end of my rope. I mean, I had a shovel in my hand ready to bury the guy. Okay. He had the 3 turnovers against Texas. He had 3 against Florida. But since that game, he has played a whole lot better. He has looked a lot more like the quarterback we saw last season and the quarterback we thought we would see all of this season than what he looked like the first 6 games of this season. After the Florida game, they played on the road at Ole Miss. Now, it was a terrible game. Georgia didn't do anything offensively. But Carson Beck only had 1 interception in that game, and that was on a tipped ball, and it's kind of hard to place that one solely on Carson Beck. Then you have the Tennessee game, no turnovers. The UMass game, which really doesn't count because it was an elementary school, but still no turnovers. And the Georgia Tech game this past week, no turnovers. Has Carson Beck turned some sort of a page? Has a light switch gone back on for him? Well, you're hoping so, obviously, if you want Georgia to win this game or you're a Georgia fan. But it's pretty clear that if you look at sort of the graph of turnovers for Carson Beck over the course of the season, it's drastically down right now heading into this SEC championship game, which is what you're going to need if Georgia's going to win this game. So there are things from that first game that might apply a little bit to what you see in the second game, but then there's a whole other list of things that happened in that first game that are extremely unlikely to happen again. The field position situation that buried Texas in that game, and in my opinion, it's unlikely Carson Beck throws 3 interceptions in this game just because it's been a long time since we've seen him do that. Now, as far as the actual matchup goes, how are these teams playing right now? I think Texas is playing a lot better right now than they were playing when this game was played the first time, particularly when it comes to running the ball. Texas suffered a lot of running back injuries really before the season even started, and it took them about half the season to kind of figure out exactly what was going on at the running back position and with the run game in particular. And if you remember, they tried a lot of different things. Even in the Georgia game, they put Arch Manning in for a couple of drives to see if he could get something going, not just with his arm, but of course he's considered to be a lot more mobile than Quinn Ewers. And in that particular game, nothing really was going Texas' way for a lot of the reasons we already talked about. Arch Manning came in, he was on his own 10-yard line, for example, to start that drive. So, but since then, if you watch Texas play, they seem to have figured some things out when it comes to the ground game. They obviously had a massive game on the ground this past week against Texas A&M. So I expect Texas to be a much more balanced team this go-round than what we saw last time, the first game in Austin, Texas. You know, the other thing is Texas fell behind early, and it's sort of a mental thing, I think, for coaching staffs and teams. You know, you a big game like that, you fall behind a couple of scores, you kind of feel like you need to score quick to get back into the game. And so a lot of times maybe you don't totally abandon your game plan or abandon the run, but your instinct is sort of, you know, we need to throw the ball around here. We need to try to, you know, get some yards, flip field position, score some points, get ourselves back in this game. And that's kind of what happened to Texas there, and they just never got anything going on the ground. Whereas right now they appear to be a pretty good team on the ground. Georgia, on the other hand, has struggled to stop the run the last 2 weeks against both UMass and Georgia Tech, particularly when it comes to running quarterbacks. And that's where the Arch Manning question comes in this game. How much are we going to see Arch Manning here compared to how much we saw him in the first game? I think significantly more. Again, to go back to last week's game, Texas versus Texas A&M, they put Arch Manning in multiple times in that game, particularly when they got down in the red zone, because of the running threat that he provides, Arch Manning, that you don't get with Quinn Ewers. I think the fact that we've seen Texas do that more with Arch Manning, combined with the fact that Georgia has shown they've had a hard time, particularly recently, stopping teams that are committed to the run, particularly with running quarterbacks. I think that leads me to believe you're probably going to see a lot more running overall from Texas in this game than what you saw in the first game, especially if they don't go down big early like they did the first go-round. Again, I can counter that by, Texas is also likely not to get 3 extra possessions via Georgia turnovers, specifically Carson Beck interceptions, like they did in the first game. Georgia's going to struggle to run the ball here too, I think. Texas defensively against the run has looked really good. A&M got nothing going offensively against them last week. They completely shut them down. And Texas is a complete defense. I think they're first in college football against the pass. But if they're not first, they're top 5. They're a top 10 defense overall for sure. And Georgia offensively, it's been kind of a roller coaster this year. In some games, they've looked totally inept. In some halves of some games, they've looked totally inept. They didn't score any points, for example, in the first half against Georgia Tech. They didn't score at all hardly against Ole Miss. You go back even earlier in the season, there were several times this year where Georgia's offense just seemed completely non-existent. And then you have times like the Texas game, like the second half of the Alabama game, like the Mississippi State game, like the Florida game to a certain degree, where offensively Georgia appears to be able to do almost anything they want to do. The drop passes for Georgia continues to be a problem. That's not something I expect to get fixed. I mean, I just think as Georgia fans, we're just going to have to live with the fact that we're going to leave 4 or 5 first downs on the field every game and potentially a score every game on the field because the receivers are going to drop the ball. I think this is going to be a really good game, a really close game. I'm very interested here in the chess match between Sarkisian and Kirby Smart. I don't know what y'all think of Sarkisian and Kirby. I think Sarkisian's one of the best offensive minds in the country. I think Kirby's one of the best defensive minds in the country. I think in round one, back a month or so ago, month and a half ago, I guess now, that first game in Austin, Texas, I think it's pretty clear that Kirby won that round in terms of sort of the in-game chess match that was going on there between the two coaching staffs. What happens this go-around? Sarkisian, in my mind, is way too smart, I think, to try the same version of a Texas offense out onto the field that Georgia saw a month and a half ago. Things are going to be different, whether it's formations, plays, motions, personnel, different personnel groupings, Arch Manning playing a more significant role, for example. And this is something that has hounded Georgia going back years. Georgia has lost some massive games, the most massive games you could possibly lose, to teams who made outright quarterback changes, in a lot of cases at halftime. You can, of course, go back to the 2017 national title game. Hurts gets benched, Tua comes in, leads Bama back against Georgia and wins a national title. The following year, 2018, in the SEC championship game, again, Georgia out to a halftime lead over starting quarterback Tua for Alabama. They then bench Tua and put Jalen Hurts back into the second half, and Alabama comes back again behind a backup quarterback and beats Georgia. And we've seen it in other instances as well. The SEC championship game from, I think it was 2021 against LSU. Jaden Daniels got hurt in the first half of that game. Georgia had a massive halftime lead. LSU goes with Nussmeier in the second half, and Nussmeier threw for like 400 yards in the second half. Now, Georgia won the game easily, but he lit Georgia's defense up in the second half. Point is, Georgia has shown a tendency to not handle backup quarterbacks very well when they're put into the game in big games. So what does that mean here if Arch Manning does come in, whether it's to completely replace Quinn Ewers, which I don't think is out of the question, by the way. Let's just say for a minute that Georgia does get out to a 2-touchdown lead or something like that, 13 points, 14 points, 16, 17, somewhere in that range at or near halftime. Would anybody be shocked or surprised if Texas comes out in the second half and Arch Manning is the quarterback? I wouldn't. Now, I think we're going to see Arch Manning either way, whether that's red zones like we saw last week against Texas A&M, whether it's change of pace type of things like we saw in the first matchup between these two teams a month and a half ago or so. And that's part of the sort of coaching chess match that I'm excited to watch in this game. These are two really talented teams. Again, both teams are headed to the playoffs. And I don't know, I don't think it takes away from any of the excitement of the game. It does take away some of the stress level and anxiety, at least for me as a fan in watching this game. I mean, if Georgia loses, okay, well, they play on December 21st in the playoffs. If they win, well, okay, they play on December 31st in the playoffs. Either way, they're headed to the playoffs, and I'm assuming Texas fans kind of have that same, I don't know if it's a sense of security or ease or whatever it is. It's just, it's not, it doesn't feel as final as it has in a lot of years past this SEC championship game. Last year in particular, it was pretty well known. A winner was going to get in and a loser was going to get out, and there's been several SEC championship games that have felt that way over the last decade during this 4-team playoff. We are, of course, now into a 12-team playoff. And so I do think there's a little bit less stress and anxiety. I'm not at all surprised that Texas is favored by 2.5 in this game. A lot of people, I think, that don't follow betting or care about betting. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, believe it or not, you can watch college football or sports in general without caring or about gambling or gambling on the game. It is possible. I know people that do it. And I think a lot of those people are looking at this and they're going, how is Texas favored by 2.5? They've already played and Georgia beat them. This is kind of a college football mentality versus the rest of the sporting world mentality, you know, because of the way college football has been structured over the last 100 years or so. Basically, rematches during a season have been extremely rare. It's not that we've never seen them. You know, we had an LSU Alabama national championship game 15 years ago or whatever it was. We have seen rematches, whether it be conference championship rematches from regular season games, or whether it be national championship rematches from regular season games, or conference championship games, or playoff rematches from regular, whatever the case. We have seen rematches. They're way more rare in college football than they are in really any other sport on the planet, whether you want to talk about the college level or the professional level. You know, NFL, for example, you play every team in your division twice every single year, and then you see a lot of rematches in the playoffs of games that you saw in the regular season. The NBA and Major League Baseball and these leagues that play, you know, in the case of the NBA, 80-something regular season games, baseball 160-something, you see rematches constantly. So it's not even something you really think about in some of these other sports. But in college football, it's been very rare. And so I think that's why it gets the amount of attention that it does. And that's why I think some people who are dialed into college football and maybe don't watch a lot of other sports, they see this line, Texas favored by -2.5, and they're scratching their head with, you know, how is that possible? I've seen these teams play. One team beat the other by 15. Why is the losing team favored by 2.5? Well, it's because people that do this kind of thing for a living, gamble or follow other types of sports, know that one outcome a month and a half later doesn't guarantee any kind of outcome now. It just doesn't. How the teams are playing now, how the teams are structured now, what motivation does each team have to win or whatever. There's a lot of things that would go into Texas being a 2.5-point favorite, even though they lost this game by 15 a month and a half ago. That being said, as bad as Georgia has looked at times this year and as frustrating as they've been to watch, the bottom line is they had one of the toughest schedules in all of college football. They somehow got through it at 10-2 with what I think is probably the worst defense Kirby Smart has had since 2016, his first year as head coach there. One of the worst performing wide receiver rooms maybe ever in Kirby's time at Georgia. Maybe the overall talent level, if you look at star ratings or recruiting ratings or whatever, might be a little bit better than some other year, but the drops have negated all that at the wide receiver position. Georgia lost its top two outside wide receivers, one before the season started, one in week 4 or 5, Ra Smith and Colby Young. Obviously a massive drop off at the tight end position, just because there's liable to never be another Brock Bowers at the University of Georgia. The running back situation is down compared to what we're used to seeing. The offensive line has underperformed at times. And on top of all that, the quarterback, who was a Heisman favorite heading into the season, is just about leading the country in interceptions this year. Despite all of that, and the toughest schedule in the country, and road games at 3 top 15 teams, and another neutral site game against the top 15 team in Clemson, somehow Georgia's sitting here at 10-2, and they're playing in the SEC championship game. I am not about to abandon ship now. I'll take Georgia to win. For betting purposes, I guess I would take the 2.5 points just in case it's a kind of a 1-point loss. You still would win the bet there, but that is what it is with the betting angle. I think Georgia finds a way to win. They're comfortable in this game. You got to remember, the seniors on Georgia's team, this is going to be their 4th straight SEC championship game. Georgia made the SEC championship game in 21, 22, 23, and now 24. And while a lot of players on this Texas team made the Big 12 title game last year and even made the playoffs last year, as a whole, Georgia's group of players is much more experienced in this spot than the Texas roster is. The game's played in Atlanta, a familiar spot for Georgia. They've already played there once this year. They play there at least once almost every single year, whether it's a neutral site game at the beginning of the year or the SEC championship game or a bowl game or a playoff game or whatever the case. It's a familiar environment for them. I think the crowd will be great. I expect there to be a ton of Texas fans there. I think it'll be pretty close to a 50-50 crowd. I think it's going to be a really, really good game. I am going to take Georgia to win. I think both teams, of course, obviously still going to end up in the playoffs. All right, be sure to let me know down below how stupid I am, and have a good morning.